Somewhere in the Alaskan interior, approximately 25 miles west of the town of Healy, a dirt road called the Stampede Trail disappears into spruce forest and rises toward the foothills of the Alaska Range. In the summer, the trail is a muddy wound through the wilderness. In the winter, it becomes indistinguishable from the land around it. Most people have never heard of it. Most people never will. But on September 6, 1992, a group of moose hunters following the trail reached a clearing in the trees and found an old Fairbanks City Transit bus, an International Harvester K5, abandoned since the early 1960s, rotting into the permafrost. It had been dragged out there decades ago as a hunting shelter. It had a cot inside, a small stove, and a skylight rusted half open. The hunters did not expect to find what they found. Inside the bus was a sleeping bag. Inside the sleeping bag was a body. The body belonged to a young man, barely more than a boy. He weighed 67 pounds. It would take 2 weeks to identify him. His name was Christopher Johnson McCandless. He was 24 years old. He had been dead for at least 2 weeks before they found him, possibly longer. His journal ended on August 18th. He had been alone in that bus, in that wilderness, for 113 days. This is not a story about adventure. It was never a story about adventure. It is a story about a young man who wanted to disappear, and succeeded so completely that no one could reach him in time. Christopher McCandless was born on February 12, 1968, in El Segundo, California, the first child of Walt and Billy McCandless. His father was a NASA antenna specialist. His mother worked alongside him at a consulting firm. By the time Christopher was a teenager, the family had relocated to Annandale, Virginia, a prosperous suburb of Washington, D.C. From the outside, the McCandless household looked like a portrait of the American professional class. 2 incomes, a large house, a son who excelled in everything he touched. Christopher was exceptional, and he knew it. He ran cross-country. He drove himself to exhaustion, running extra miles in the dark when his teammates had gone home. His high school coach remembered him as the kind of athlete who competed not against others, but against some private standard he had invented for himself. He was a gifted student, passionate about history, literature, and the outdoors. He was also, by the accounts of those closest to him, profoundly idealistic in a way that made ordinary compromises feel like moral failures. He had grown up in the shadow of a secret. Walt McCandless, his father, had maintained a double life for years, a first family he had never fully separated from before beginning a second one with Billy. Christopher discovered this as a teenager and never fully recovered from it. Those who knew him well understood that something had broken in him at the seams of that discovery. He had learned that the people closest to him were capable of elaborate deception, that the polished surface of a comfortable life could conceal fundamental dishonesty. He never said this directly. Instead, he began to say everything he was thinking, except the things that mattered most. In the fall of 1986, Christopher enrolled at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He studied history and anthropology. He graduated with honors in 1990. During his years at Emory, he became increasingly consumed by the writing of Leo Tolstoy, specifically Tolstoy's late moral essays, in which the Russian novelist renounced his own wealth, condemned the institution of private property, and argued that a life of spiritual and material simplicity was the only honest way to live. Christopher annotated his copies of these books so heavily that the margins became a second text. He underlined the passages that burned in him. He committed certain sentences to memory the way other people memorize prayers. He also became obsessed with Henry David Thoreau, with Jack London, with authors who wrote about the wilderness not as a backdrop but as a site of genuine reckoning, a place where a man's worth could be tested against something real, something indifferent, something that could not be manipulated or bought. After graduation, his parents expected him to apply to law school. He said nothing. He accepted $2,000 from a graduation gift fund and quietly gave the remaining $24,000 in his college savings account to Oxfam. He told no one. In July 1990, he drove out of his parents' neighborhood for what he believed was a short trip. He did not come back. He wrote a brief letter explaining that he needed to be alone, needed to disappear, needed to find out who he was when stripped of everything accumulated. He told them not to worry. He gave almost no details about where he was going. The letter contained no return address. He was 22 years old. He left behind his real name, or tried to. In his journal, he began calling himself Alexander Supertramp. He had taken the name partly from the writings of W.H. Davies, a Welsh poet and vagabond of the early 20th century who romanticized tramping as a form of liberty. Christopher wanted a new name because he wanted to be a new person, or perhaps more accurately, he wanted to find out if there was a person underneath the name and the family and the diplomas and the expectations. He donated most of his remaining cash. He abandoned his car, a Datsun B210, after a flash flood in the Arizona desert damaged it. He was not interested in recovering it. He burned what cash remained in his wallet. He began hitchhiking. What followed was 2 years of extraordinary, erratic, often beautiful, often disturbing wandering. The people who met Christopher McCandless during those 2 years describe him with a strange consistency. Almost everyone found him immediately compelling. He was physically striking, high cheekbones, dark eyes, a lean intensity that made people feel he was seeing them clearly. He was curious. He asked questions about other people's lives and seemed to genuinely care about the answers. He could talk about literature and history for hours, growing more animated with each exchange. Women were drawn to him. Older men wanted to adopt him. And then he would leave, with almost no warning, and they would never hear from him again. In the fall of 1990, he made his way to the Lake Mead area of Nevada, where he set up a camp near the Colorado River and lived for several weeks on rice and game. A flash flood forced him to move, but the experience sharpened something in him, a kind of satisfaction with bare subsistence that he found almost euphoric. He documented his moods in his journal with a combination of literary affectation and raw honesty that reads today like something between a young man discovering himself and a young man slowly erasing himself. He drifted into California. He worked the harvest fields in the San Joaquin Valley, picking grain alongside migrant workers, sleeping in his car or under the open sky. He wrote about the dignity of physical labor with the enthusiasm of someone who had never had to depend on it. He worked briefly in a grain elevator in Carthage, South Dakota, where he befriended a man named Wayne Westerberg, who ran a grain elevator operation and took in drifters during the harvest season. Westerberg was not a romantic figure. He was a practical, plain-spoken businessman with a complicated past. But he recognized something in Christopher that he respected, and the two developed a genuine friendship. Christopher worked hard. He was reliable. Westerberg later told investigators and journalists that if Christopher had wanted to, he could have built a real life in Carthage. He could have stayed. The door was open. He left. He paddled a canoe he had acquired down the Colorado River, navigating a series of irrigation channels that allowed him to reach the Gulf of California in January 1991. A Mexican police officer tried to confiscate the canoe at one point. Christopher charmed his way through the confrontation. He made it to the Sea of Cortez and set up camp on the beach. He later described these days on the Mexican coast as among the happiest of his life. The water was warm. He was invisible. He had nothing. He began making his way back toward the American Southwest, and then east. He picked up odd jobs. He spent time in Bullhead City, Arizona, working at a McDonald's, sleeping in a trailer park. His co-workers there remember him as quiet and somewhat melancholy. One of them noted that he seemed to be marking time, waiting for something only he knew about. He returned to Westerberg's operation in the fall of 1991 for the second harvest season. He wrote postcards to people he had met along the way. He saved money carefully. Throughout this period, he maintained an almost total silence toward his family. His parents, his sister Corinne, to whom he was deeply attached, heard almost nothing. Corinne later wrote that the silence was its own kind of message. He was not missing, he was gone by choice, and that distinction was somehow the most painful part. He read voraciously Boris Pasternak, Nikolai Gogol. He had a habit of underlining passages that felt urgent to him and writing responses in the margins, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes elaborating, sometimes simply writing a single word that seemed to him to capture what the author was reaching toward. In Dr. Zhivago, he underlined a passage about the impossibility of happiness in a forced, artificial condition and wrote beside it, "This is what I am trying to escape." In another passage about the profound importance of direct experience, of life touched directly, without mediation, he wrote, "Yes." By the winter of 1991 into 1992, his entries begin to shift. The enthusiasm becomes more urgent. The references to Alaska become more frequent. He had been planning the Alaska venture for some time, but the language hardens into something that sounds like resolution. He was not simply hoping to go. He was going. He told Westerberg he planned to walk into the Alaskan wilderness in the spring. Westerberg remembered being uneasy. He knew Alaska. He told Christopher to bring a good map and a reliable weapon. Christopher was not particularly interested in either. In April 1992, Christopher hitchhiked north from South Dakota through Montana into Canada and into the Yukon. The landscape outside the truck windows would have changed profoundly with each passing day, from the flat grain country of the Dakotas to the rocky Canadian Shield, and then into something else entirely. Something older. Something that doesn't care whether you're watching. His last ride was with a man named Jim Gallion, an electrician who picked up a young hitchhiker south of Fairbanks on the morning of April 28, 1992. Gallion later told investigators that the young man was carrying a 10-pound bag of rice, a bolt-action .22 caliber rifle that Gallion considered underpowered for the Alaskan bush, a handful of books, and almost no other equipment. He had no compass. He had no map of the specific area he was heading into. He had waterproof gear that Gallion considered wholly inadequate. His boots were cheap and already worn. Gallion drove him to the Stampede Trail. During the drive, Gallion tried to dissuade him from going in. He offered to take him to Anchorage to buy more gear. He offered food. He offered his work boots. Christopher accepted a pair of rubber overshoes and a small bag of corn chips, declined everything else, and thanked Gallion with what Gallion described as absolute certainty. Not bravado, not naivety, but the calm of someone who has made a decision so completely that doubt no longer has access to it. Gallion dropped him at the trailhead around 8 a.m. He watched Christopher walk into the trees until he disappeared. He was worried enough that he later told his wife and 2 co-workers about the encounter. He kept waiting to hear that something had gone wrong. He was not wrong to worry. Christopher walked 25 miles down the Stampede Trail and came to the Tuklanika River. In late April, the river was running low and he crossed without difficulty. He found the abandoned bus. He decided it would be his base camp for the duration of his wilderness stay. He documented his arrival in his journal with a single note, written with something close to joy. Magic bus day. For the first several weeks, things went relatively well. He
He hunted ptarmigan and porcupine with his .22 rifle. He gathered plants. He observed the wilderness around him with the attentiveness of someone who had been waiting his whole life to do exactly this. His journal entries from May are full of genuine observation, notes on animal behavior, notes on the changing quality of the light, notes on his own mental state. He was happy in a way that the previous 2 years, despite their freedom and movement, had never quite achieved. He shot a moose in late June or early July. This was the event that marked a turning point, though not in the way he could have anticipated. The moose was too large for him to process alone, and without refrigeration in temperatures that could reach 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the meat spoiled within days despite his attempts to preserve it. He described the loss in his journal with something close to despair, calling it one of the most tragic things that had ever happened to him. He had been counting on that meat. He worked to dry some of it, but most was lost to flies and rot. The protein he had been relying on was gone. Through July, his entries document increasing physical weakness alongside an emotional intensity that suggests he was, even then, beginning to understand his situation. He shot more small game. He gathered wild berries and roots. He had Ron Stuckey's Field Guide to Edible Plants of the North, and relied on it heavily. His caloric intake was catastrophically insufficient for the physical demands of wilderness survival at that latitude. At some point in July, he made the decision to leave. He had been in the bush long enough. He gathered his things. He walked back down the Stampede Trail toward the road. He reached the Teclanica River and could not cross it. The river he had crossed in late April, when snowmelt had not yet peaked, had transformed by July into a brown, roaring channel running at least 65 feet wide and shoulder deep, with a current strong enough to knock a healthy man off his feet. Christopher was not healthy. He did not have a map that would have shown him that a hand-operated cable crossing, a gauging station, existed just a few miles downstream, well within walking distance. Without that knowledge, the river was a wall. He walked back to the bus. This is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire story. A young man standing at the bank of a river, looking at what has become an impassable boundary, and turning around. Not dramatically, not heroically, simply turning around and walking back to the place where he had camped, because there was nothing else to do. He continued to write. He continued to hunt. He ate roots and berries. He began noting in his journal an increasing weakness. His photographs from this period, he had a camera and documented his experience with it, show a man who has lost weight with alarming speed. His cheeks have hollowed. His eyes are bright in a way that photographs of the very sick sometimes look bright. He was starving. Investigators and researchers later focused closely on one particular food source he was consuming during this period: the seeds of wild potato, Hedysarum alpinum. The roots of the plant are edible, and he had been eating them regularly since spring. But in July and August, he had begun eating the seeds as well. A 2013 study by Drive Ronald Hamilton confirmed what several researchers had theorized. The seeds of Hedysarum alpinum contain a compound, L-canavanine, which interferes with the human body's ability to metabolize amino acids, essentially causing a form of paralysis in the digestive system. In someone already severely malnourished, this effect would have been profoundly accelerating. His body was being starved not just of calories, but of the capacity to process what little it received. This was the theory John Krakauer himself came to adopt after years of research and debate, reversing his earlier speculation about a different toxic mechanism. It remains a theory, not a confirmed fact. The exact cause of Christopher's death has never been definitively established through autopsy. The condition of the body made that impossible. Starvation is listed on the official death certificate. It is almost certainly accurate.
Whether the seeds were a significant contributing factor remains a matter of genuine scientific debate. What is not debatable is what happened to him. He grew weaker. He could no longer hunt effectively. He was writing in his journal that he was now too weak to walk. He took a photograph of himself near the end, holding a note that said, "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye and may God bless all." And in that photograph, the person looking back at the camera does not look like a 24-year-old man. He looks like someone very old and very far away. His final journal entry was August 18, 1992. The moose hunters found him 19 days later. The investigation that followed reconstructed a timeline with as much precision as the evidence allowed. Park rangers and state troopers went over the bus and its surroundings carefully. They found the journal. They found the camera with its developed photographs. They found his rifle, still with ammunition. They found the field guide with its annotations. They found evidence of his hunting efforts, his food stores, his daily routine. What they could not fully reconstruct was the interior experience, what it had felt like, in those final weeks, to lie in the sleeping bag in the bus while the Alaskan summer moved through its endless hours of light. What it had felt like to understand, as he surely did, that he was dying. Whether he was afraid, whether he was at peace, whether he regretted coming. The last photograph he took of himself suggests someone who had moved through fear and into something else. But photographs do not tell you what is behind the eyes. The question of whether Christopher McCandless was reckless or idealistic, or mentally ill or brave, or all of these simultaneously, has never been resolved, because it is not a question that has a single answer. Different people who read his story bring to it their own needs, their own fears, their own memories of times they wanted to run from everything familiar. Hikers and survivalists have argued that he was simply unprepared, that Alaska is unforgiving, and that the absence of a map and an adequate weapon and sufficient caloric knowledge was not philosophy but negligence. Psychologists have pointed to the family background, the pathological rejection of intimacy, the grandiosity. Others have simply read his journal and found in it someone deeply alive, someone searching for something real in a world that increasingly felt manufactured. John Krakauer, who wrote the book and article that brought Christopher's story to a wide audience, was transparent about his own identification with what he saw as Christopher's core impulse, the young man's desire to test himself against something unmediated, to live at the absolute edge of his own capacity. Krakauer had done this himself, in the mountains. He understood it from the inside. His critics have argued that this identification led him to romanticize a death that was, in purely practical terms, largely preventable. His defenders have argued that the preventability is precisely the point, that we don't condemn preventable deaths when the person is climbing Everest, or racing motorcycles, or fighting wars, and that the judgment applied to McCandless is often a judgment against a certain kind of restless, uncompromising spirit that makes established people uncomfortable. None of these arguments reach into the bus. None of them are present in the final weeks of that summer. Walt and Billy McCandless received the news of their son's death in September 1992. They had received so little information about his whereabouts over the previous 2 years that even now, even knowing he was gone, the full shape of what he had been doing remained unclear to them. The letters and journals recovered from the bus were the first detailed account they had of the 2 years since he had left. Corrine McCandless, Christopher's sister, has spoken and written about her grief with a directness that is both precise and painful. She and Christopher had been close in a way that their shared family difficulties had intensified rather than eroded. She has been clear about the damage their father's double life did to the family, and clear about how that damage moved through Christopher in ways that she believes contributed to his decision to leave. She has also been clear that she does not entirely blame their parents, that she understands human weakness, and that the story of her family is not a story of villains and victims, but of people failing each other in ordinary human ways with extraordinary consequences. What Corinne has returned to, in her writing and interviews, is the question of what might have happened differently. Not in Alaska. She has said she does not think the wilderness took something from Christopher that he had not in some sense brought with him. But earlier, in the house, in the conversations that never happened, in the moment when a young man decided that the most honest response to a world of imperfect people was to leave it entirely. After Krakauer's article ran in Outside magazine in 1993, and after the book was published in 1996, and after Sean Penn's film adaptation was released in 2007, the bus on the Stampede Trail became something it had never been before, a pilgrimage site. Hundreds of people made the journey to see it. Several of them nearly died crossing the same Tuklanika River that had stopped Christopher from leaving. In 2020, the Alaska Army National Guard airlifted the bus out of its location, citing the repeated search and rescue operations that hikers in distress had required. The bus was transported to the Museum of the North at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where it remains. The clearing where the bus once sat is now just a clearing. Spruce trees, tundra grasses, the river running somewhere in the middle distance. Nothing marks the spot in any official way. There are people who go into the wilderness and come back changed. There are people who go in and do not come back at all. The border between these two groups is not always a matter of skill or preparation or intelligence. Sometimes it is a matter of timing, of weather, of the precise water level of a particular river on a particular day, of the difference between a species of plant being edible in root form and potentially harmful in seed form, a distinction that might require a degree of botanical specialization that no general field guide can fully provide. But it would not be honest to reduce Christopher McCandless to a victim of circumstance. He was the author of his own isolation in ways that go beyond any single decision he made in Alaska. He had, over 2 years, practiced the radical refusal of help, the refusal of better gear, of maps, of companions, of warnings. He had cultivated a philosophy in which the acceptance of other people's support felt like a compromise of something essential. Thoreau, writing in Walden, had the town of Concord 1.5 miles away. He could visit his mother for dinner. Christopher understood Thoreau's words without Thoreau's safety net, and perhaps did not care, or perhaps believed that the safety net was precisely what Thoreau had failed to eliminate. What we are left with, finally, is not a lesson. The temptation to extract a lesson from Christopher's death is understandable, but somewhat dishonest. The lesson changes depending on what you are afraid of, what you have lost, what you are searching for. To someone who has spent their life inside structures they did not choose, his story looks like something that almost worked, a desperate, beautiful attempt to find the world underneath the world. To someone who has buried a child, his story looks like a terrible, preventable loss. To a wilderness guide, it looks like an accident waiting to happen. To a philosopher, it looks like the oldest story there is, a human being who took an idea to its absolute limit and discovered the limit. The abandoned bus, now in a museum behind glass, accessible to visitors who can see it in a climate-controlled room, has become a kind of ironic monument to everything Christopher was running from. What he wanted was something that cannot be preserved or displayed or driven to and photographed. He wanted to be so fully present in the world that there was nothing left between him and the basic fact of being alive. He wanted the cold to be cold, the hunger to be hunger, the silence to be silence, with nothing softening any of it. In the end, he got exactly what he asked for. The cold was very cold. The hunger was terrible and absolute. And the silence of that bus, in that clearing, in those final weeks, was the kind of silence that exists only when no one can hear you. His journal ends mid-sentence. Not at a conclusion. Not at an epiphany. Just a thought, interrupted. Somewhere beyond the edge of what we can know, a 24-year-old man lay in a sleeping bag in an abandoned bus and looked at the Alaskan sky through a rusted skylight and understood something about the world that he never had the chance to tell anyone. What he understood, we don't know. The journal doesn't say. The photographs don't show it. But the last note he left, the one he wrote and photographed, the one that ended with "May God bless all," contains no anger, no regret, no bitterness toward the wilderness that was killing him. If it is authentic, and researchers have no reason to believe it isn't, then Christopher McCandless died the way he had lived, at absolute proximity to his own experience, with no distance between himself and whatever was happening to him. The question that lingers, long after the story ends, is not whether he was brave or foolish or broken or inspired. The question is whether those distinctions matter to the cold. They don't, of course. The wilderness is genuinely indifferent. It was indifferent to his journals and his idealism and his beauty and his pain. It was indifferent to the family who would grieve him and the strangers who would come to love his story. The Taclanica River did not know his name when it stopped him from leaving. The seeds did not know what they were doing to him. The Alaskan summer light, which would have shone for 20 hours a day through his final weeks, did not know that he was dying in it. This is what he went there to find. The truth that the world continues regardless of whether you are in it. That nature does not need us. That freedom, absolute and unmediated, is indistinguishable, in the end, from absolute solitude. He found it, and the land closed over him the way land always closes over everything, quietly, indifferently, without ceremony. The only thing that remains is the story, and the story remains because we need it to, because something in us recognizes what Christopher was looking for, even if we would never go looking for it ourselves. Even if we are relieved, on some level, that we would never go that far. We keep the story because it asks something of us, because it refuses to resolve into comfort or condemnation. Because a young man walked into the wilderness and left behind a journal and a camera and a final note and a sleeping bag and 80 days of silence before anyone came looking. And we cannot stop asking what he found there.